Torah gives you a way of life that is meaningful, that helps you deal with the challenges of life, right? Because life is full of suffering. And what do? Lachat chila a river to begin with, be on the other side of it. My wife was in the hospital for 29 days when she first took my daughter to the hospital. She didn't come home for an entire month. And I remember sitting at the kitchen table when she got home and we sat there, we just looked at each other for like literally 15 minutes. We didn't say anything to each other. And I finally turned to my wife and I said, honey, we are not going to become a family with a sick child. Lechatchila a river. To begin with, we're going to be on the other side of this challenge.
Welcome to Ordinary People with Extraordinary Stories. I'm Chana Weisberg, host of this podcast. Joining me today, we have an incredible guest. His name is Yosef Hashimi, and he has a really incredible story to share with us, a life journey. He was born to a Muslim father and a Jewish mother, and he's going to tell us all about that.
Nice. Thank you for having me today. Really appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you. So I know you're a prominent member of the Pittsburgh Chabad community today. How did it all begin?
So, as you alluded to, I was born to a Muslim father and a Jewish mother. I was actually born in Kabul, Afghanistan, and
Ooh.
um, I was born in December of 1967 in Kabul, Afghanistan, in the American Embassy Hospital. And so, as I like to joke, I can be the president of the United States.
Wow.
So, not that
How
I
long
have
did you live? How long? Not that you have
not that I
aspirations.
have aspirations for that, right? No, no. Um,
How long did you live in Kabul?
so I lived in Kabul for the first 2.5 years of my life. So, kind of let me tell you how we got there. So my father was born in 1937 in Kabul, Afghanistan. My father is a direct descendant of Mohammed. How do we know this? Our family's name, my father's family are Sunni Muslims, and our family's given name, their first name is Syed. And within
Mm,
the Sunni world, anybody who sees my first name, and my legal name is Syed. Syed Yosef Hashimi is my name on my passport. I'm Yosef Zev in
mm,
my Hebrew name. Uh, and so anybody with the name Syed is recognized as a descendant of Muhammad. Now, Muhammad um, only had one child. Her name was Fatima. And from her all the way down, I'm a descendant of Muhammad ben Achar ben, kind of
mhm.
the way a
Son
Kohen,
after son.
right? Yeah, son after son. Just like a Kohen or a Levi knows that they're a Kohen or a Levi because of their father, the same thing. And so every male that descends from a male in our family, his first name is Syed. So if you go to a family reunion, we don't use our first names. So,
Really? Wow.
so
Interesting.
um,
And is that considered a very prestigious kind of
abs-
lineage?
absolutely.
Hmm.
If you're a descendant of Muhammad, it's considered very prestigious. Uh, in fact, you know, later in life, um, I didn't really learn how prestigious that was until, later in life. But I'll get to that story later. So my father, when he was 7 years old, he was sent to a British boarding school in Alexandria, Egypt, called Victoria College, along with his older brother and his first cousin. And my father basically stayed in Alexandria, was educated in English. My father, his family
Where was he
speaks.
born?
My father was born in Kabul, Afghanistan. Okay,
Oh,
and
he was born. Okay, and then
yeah, yeah, and in 1937, and his father sent him, his older brother, and one of his cousins to Alexandria to be educated. Victoria College is a British boarding school. It was kind of known as a school that a lot of Middle Eastern, wealthy people sent their kids to school there.
Mm.
My father went to school with, at the time, he was the Crown Prince of Jordan. He's the current King of Jordan's father. So my father went to school with him.
Oh, wow. Mm.
Adnan Khashoggi, who's now sitting in a federal penitentiary for arms dealing. Sheikh Yamani in Saudi Arabia, and Omar Sharif, the famous actor. They all
Oh,
went
wow.
to school with my father at Victoria College,
All the
and
top guns,
all the
the big
top
top
guns.
guns.
Yeah,
Okay.
my father's family was very well to do. My grandfather was a merchant. He did international trade. Um, and then eventually he got into the banking system when the Royal Bank of Afghanistan opened up. Um, but in addition, our last name is Hashimi. So if you're familiar with the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan, we're cousins.
Mm.
Um,
Mm.
so, uh, so my father uh, basically grew up being educated by the English, spoke English. He's actually illiterate in Farsi in terms of reading and writing. He speaks Farsi, but he can't read or write Farsi because he basically, when he was 7 years old, he started learning in English.
Mm.
And so uh, he went to school in Alexandria all the way up until he graduated high school. He was the head boy of his high school class, means the kind of like the class president. Um,
Mm.
and then uh, when he graduated, he went back to Afghanistan. He got his undergraduate degree in Afghanistan. And so you have to remember, right now it's the middle of the Cold War, or the beginning of the Cold War, right? It's late 50s, early 60s, and the Russians were trying to get people to come and be educated in the Soviet Union, and the
Mm.
Americans were doing the same thing, trying to get people to come and be educated in the United States. And USAID, which I know has been in the news recently,
Mm.
but they have programs to bring students over, foreign students, to be educated here. And my father, having grown up speaking English, right, and grown up around the British, he was highly westernized. My father's family were Part of my father's family was devout Muslims, but my father's family was more secular Muslims, right? Okay.
Mhm.
Um, and so my father got offered a scholarship to come to the United States, and by divine providence, USAID actually sent him to the wrong school.
Oh, wow.
Okay.
Wow.
Um, and he was here to study. My father was a civil engineer. He studied civil engineering, and he came to the United States to get his master's degree in civil engineering. And he ended up at the University of Arizona, and he looked at his roster of classes, and he was like, "Why am I taking all these agriculture classes? What's going on?" And they're like, "Well, aren't you here to study agriculture?" He's like, "No." So they called the Washington office, and they're like, "Oh my gosh, we were supposed to send you to the University of Iowa." So he's
Oh.
he's looking around at all the nice palm trees and the warm weather, and he's like, "Ah, I'll
Stay
stay
here.
here."
Right.
And so my dad was in Tucson, Arizona, going to graduate school in Tucson, Arizona. So my mother uh, may she rest in peace. She was born in January of 1944 in Detroit, Michigan. Um, my Bubby's family, my mother's mother, her family were Stolener Hasidim.
Mm.
In fact, one of the Stolener Rebbes is called the Detroiter Rebbe, and the reason he's called the Detroiter Rebbe is because he passed away um, uh, on a visit to Detroit, and he, you know, he stayed with my Alta Alta Bubba and Zeta,
Mm.
my great great grandparents. He stayed in their house when he would visit, and when he died there, he had brought his white garbs to be buried in, so they buried him in Detroit. And my great great grandfather is buried 3 graves away from him.
Wow.
Um,
Wow.
so
Incredible.
my mother's mother was the oldest of 6 children, um, and back when they came, the family came in the early 1900s, 1902. And my bubby and all of her siblings basically went into the conservative movement. So they kind
Mm.
of went away from being religious observant Jews, but very traditional, extremely traditional family. And so all of them, basically went into the conservative movement. My Zeta,
Even even though they were Slonim or Hasidim before
yeah,
that,
yeah, they were
right?
they were still in her Chassidim before that, exactly. So
Mhm.
so, assimilation, United States,
Right.
that's the way it goes. And now my Zeta was born in Bridgeport, Connecticut, and his family to this day, my Zeta was only one of two people in his family that did not stay religious. To this
Mhm.
day, my Zeta's entire family are all religious Jews. Um,
Wow.
and so, but my Bubby and Zeta got married. And my mom was born in Detroit. And in 1957, after a trip to Mexico, they were driving back from Mexico. They went through Phoenix, Arizona, and they fell in love with it. And so they moved from Detroit to Phoenix in 1957. My mom, my mom was hard of hearing. My mom was mostly deaf in one ear, partially deaf in the other. She wore hearing aids. Now, she became deaf when she was like about 3 years old, so she had already learned how to speak. So
Mm.
she didn't sign language or anything like that. But she graduated high school and she went to the University of Arizona
Wow.
in Tucson. And so one day my dad saw my mom in the student union, and my mom, as a hard of hearing person, was tended to be very shy and reserved. And this young man, boys didn't usually pay attention to her. How high school is,
Really?
right? If they know you're
Mm.
deaf, right? They, not going to really pay much attention to you. So she just minded her own business most of the time. But he didn't know, right? So he went up, approached her, and um, they started talking. He asked her out, and he quips that he tells a joke. He says, "The first," he said, I'm such an idiot. The first thing I asked her to do is I took her out to a Chinese restaurant. I get to the restaurant and I'm looking at the menu and everything's pork, and I don't eat pork. And
Right.
I'm like, what do I do? What do I do? And he says to my mom, he says, I'm a Muslim, and I don't eat pork. And so if we could just stay away from the pork and order chicken or beef. And my mom says, oh, that's okay. I keep kosher. I don't eat pork
Wow.
either.
Right.
And so,
So
uh,
how did they both feel at that moment about dating somebody who a Muslim dating a Jew,
um,
and a Jew dating a
I
Muslim?
mean, obviously, so
It didn't matter to them? They were okay with
so
that?
in the Muslim faith, you can marry a Jewish woman, right? There's no
Mhm.
there's no
Mhm.
there's nothing that says it's against the rules, right?
Mhm.
Uh, and you know, my mom, clearly my Bubby and Zeta were not happy about it.
Mhm.
In fact, a couple years later, after they dated and they came in the summer of 1966, they drove from Tucson up to Phoenix, where my Bubby and Zeta lived. And my mom and dad informed them that they were getting married, and that they were going to move to the other side of the world, to Afghanistan.
Mhm.
Um,
That
this
must
was
have been a shock.
It was a huge shock. Aside from marrying a non-Jew, they had gotten to know my dad and they liked my dad and everything, but it was really more that, back then you have to remember there were no cell phones, there was no WhatsApp, there was
Of
only long
course.
distance, it was very expensive. Would they ever see their grandkids? These were the things
Sure.
that they were more concerned about. And besides, it's right next to the Soviet Union, right? So,
Right.
right. So, but my mom and dad got married in December of 1966 in Kabul. Um, and
Were your grandparents there?
No, no,
No.
nobody was there. And so it's actually a story that I didn't actually hear until Shiva with my mom, where my dad told the story at Shiva for my mother, who passed away just about 5 years ago. Her fifth yahrzeit is coming up in
Mm.
September. Um, and he told the story that at a Jewish wedding you have the men in one room, in an Orthodox Jewish wedding, that beforehand, right, and you have the women in a different room, and then there's the processional where the men go over to the woman's side and the groom puts on the veil for the bride, right, that whole tradition of a Jewish wedding.
Sure.
Well, in a Muslim wedding, it's very similar in some respects, right? There's not really the veil or anything like that, but the women are in one room and the men are in,
Mm.
in a different room, right?
Mm.
So everybody's over with my dad, And my mom, the women honestly aren't really paying much attention to her. They have really
Yeah.
and she doesn't speak Farsi. She's an American. They weren't really upset that she was Jewish or anything like that. It was more that she was an American and she wasn't a Persian that really
Such a
troubled them.
cultural shock,
Right,
sure. Such a
right.
cultural difference, yeah.
And so she was by herself, and the imam, the equivalent of the rabbi, he saw that she was all alone. And to his credit, he went and he got all the men and all the women and he brought them over. And my father says that
Mm,
he basically said, he says, "You see this woman here? She left her entire life that she grew up with across the
mhm,
world to come and marry this man. She must love him very dearly and she deserves your respect." And after
mm,
that, the women in the community started to be much kinder to her and accept
mhm.
her. Um, so I was born a year later in December of 1967. Again, I was born in the American Embassy Hospital. Um,
W
I had my circumcision in the hospital.
Mhm.
And then, now my my parents had made an arrangement. People often ask, like
Yeah, what was life like? What did they decide amongst how they're gonna raise the children and
right,
what's
exactly, exactly. So my parents made an arrangement, an agreement before they got married, that if they lived in Afghanistan, which was the plan, my father had 5 homes. His family had
Mhm,
5 homes throughout Afghanistan. Very wealthy. I had maids and
mhm,
servants, nannies, and whatever. We lived a very comfortable life in Afghanistan. My father was the head of the Civil Waterworks Division, so building dams and canals and irrigation systems. That was what my dad's job was. My mom worked in the American Embassy as a
mhm,
secretary and doing administrative work. My mom had studied accounting, and so they were living a very comfortable life. And they had made this arrangement that if they lived in Afghanistan, they would raise their children as Muslims.
mhm,
Um, but if for any reason they had to come back to the United States, because keep in mind, again, it was the Cold War, they would raise their children as Jews. Okay.
interesting. So that
And
was the deal.
that was the deal. And it was predominantly because of what the family dynamic was, right? So if you're in Afghanistan, the whole family is Muslim. So you don't
Mhm,
want to like have totally different traditions than the family there. And if you
mhm,
come to the United States, the family here is Jewish. So you want to,
mhm. So it was a very pragmatic kind of
ve-
agreement.
right, right. Um,
Were you
so
close to your Muslim cousins?
Um, well, I mean, I was 2.5 when I left, so
Right.
I have, I'll,
Yeah,
I'll get into that in a little bit later because when we talk,
sure.
a little bit later. But I mean, I mean, yes, our families are, there's no animosity or anything like that. But like any families, we grow apart, and people are older, and especially United, most of them are now in the United States because
Mm,
they escaped Afghanistan. So you know how that goes. So now they're also assimilating, right?
very
and
interesting.
and and spreading out to different places. I have relatives in Virginia and California and Missouri and Michigan. They're all
Do
over, right?
do you keep
So
in touch with them?
some of them, but not many.
Mhm.
Um, uh, but I wouldn't say more or less than my distant cousins in my Jewish side of my family,
Right,
right?
right.
So so, but um, uh, when I was about 1.5, my father when you're my mom was working in the embassy, so you know I wouldn't say that my father, and my father really won't talk about this. I wouldn't say my father was working with the CIA, right?
Mm,
but
mm.
but obviously if you're hanging around people from the American embassy in Kabul, Afghanistan in the middle of the Cold War, they're not all from the State Department, if you know what I mean,
Right. There
right?
was connections there,
Yeah,
strong
so
connections.
so my father was clearly, whether he was feeding information to them, I don't know, but he was
Mhm,
definitely getting information because he came to
mhm,
my mother, and there was the king's nephew was named Daoud, and he had been educated in the Soviet Union, and he came back a communist. So
mhm.
he was the foreign minister. And my father basically told my mother, look, it doesn't look like things are headed in the right direction here in Afghanistan. This was 1969. I think we should leave. We can live here comfortably, but if there's any type of, coup or anything like that, the first thing they do is kill the wealthy Western people, of which I'm
Right.
one of, and
Right.
my
Sure.
mother says, "Well, I like you alive, so let
Yeah. Let's do
so
that. Right.
let's do that." So, but my father was viewed as a Western sympathizer, right? As an American
Right.
sympathizer. So Daoud was the foreign minister. You had, and back then you had to get an exit visa. You couldn't just leave.
Oh.
And so my dad started applying for this exit visa, and he couldn't get one. And Daoud hated my father. My father hated Daoud. They knew each other for years and years.
Mm.
And so Daoud would not let my dad leave. And um, so um, my mother had taken me to the United States when I was 8 months old, and I actually had it would, it's if you're already circumcised, there's a procedure that the mohel can do to take a drop of blood. So my mom had that done, and I got my Hebrew name. That's how I actually know my name is Yosef Zeb, because I actually have a bris milah certificate
Oh, wow.
from that.
Wow.
That was in Detroit. But
So your mother still felt some kind of connection that she wanted to
yeah,
give you a
yeah,
Jewish name. Yeah.
exactly. And so because I'm Jewish, right? Because my
Of
mother's Jewish,
course.
right? But it was, what
Sure.
was I going to be raised, right?
Mhm.
Um so my dad finally said, okay, that's it. And they applied for two tourist visas, and the tourist visa allowed you one piece of luggage and $75.
Mhm.
And so my mom took all of her jewelry, all of her valuable things, and packed it in their two pieces of luggage. My parents smuggled some uh, Afghan rugs and some furniture
Mm.
that were family heirlooms through a diplomatic pouch to the American embassy.
Mhm.
So the American embassy was aware that they were escaping and helped them.
Mhm. Mhm.
And um, they got on a plane, and each wore multiple layers of clothing. Like my father
Mhm.
said, he had 12 pairs of underwear on, I think, or something like that,
Really?
right?
Wow.
Right. And they flew to Baghdad. They took part of their $150. They bought another third piece of luggage. They took their clothing and put it in that piece of luggage.
Mm.
They flew to Beirut. They flew to New York. They flew to St. Louis. They flew to Phoenix, Arizona, and they showed up on my Bubby and Zeta's door with $10
Mm.
left.
Wow. Wow. What a change from all those houses and everything that they owned. Wow.
Yeah. So
Wow.
my father left his entire fortune behind.
Mhm.
Multi-millionaire,
Mhm.
left everything behind, and um, he was offered a job in the Army Corps of Engineers, but he turned that job down
So
because,
he just felt that it was too dangerous there, that he realized things were happening there and it was just gonna be too dangerous for him.
yeah, in fact, what happened is in 1973, Daoud overthrew the king. Daoud
Mhm.
led a communist coup. It was a bloodless coup because it was his uncle.
Mhm.
So the king went to Rome, and Daoud called him up and said, "Don't come back. If you come back, I'm going to have to kill you."
Wow.
And the king of Afghanistan lived in Rome until he died in the early 2000s.
Hmm.
So, um, and so Daoud overthrew and took over and became the head of the government there. The same guy that wouldn't let my dad out.
Mhm.
And then that's when the Mujahideen, the Afghan, religious freedom fighters, started, their civil war, right? So civil
Mhm.
war broke out. Um,
So it was
with
smart that he left when he did.
Right. Well, so then you know the army was helping, and they were fighting, and Daoud was not really a warmonger. He was more of, a diplomat, a politician, type of a guy. And the army basically didn't feel he was strong enough, so they killed him in
Mm.
1976.
Mm.
So it was a military coup. They
Mm.
killed him, and they wiped out all my dad's friends that stayed.
Oh,
Off,
wow.
just kill.
Wow.
So if my dad had stayed, my dad definitely would not have
Would have been
survived.
his end.
Yeah,
So he
yeah. And
he
so
shows up on your grandparents' doorstep, and what happened then? I mean, that must have been such a huge change for him to adapt to that new situation.
Yeah, I mean, so my dad speaks English, and but now he's got to look for a job. So like I said, he turned down a job with the Army Corps of Engineers because even though you're a civilian, you're in the army. You go where they tell you to go, right? If there's a dam in Alaska that needs to get
Mm.
built,
Mhm.
you're up in Alaska for as long as it takes, right?
You're
And
there.
he didn't want to move around.
Mhm.
So my my Zeta, my mother's father, owned two businesses. He owned an automotive parts business and he owned an automotive repair center. And so my dad started to
Mhm.
go work for my Zeta. He went to work for my Zeta in the automotive parts business, and then they agreed that my Zeta would sell my dad the automotive repair center. Okay, so my dad
Mhm.
basically was an auto mechanic. That's what my dad did.
Mhm.
And my mom was a tax accountant. She worked for my great uncle Mickey. May he rest in peace. And we lived, I'd say a lower middle class lifestyle. We
Mhm.
were middle
Mhm.
class. We weren't wealthy. We weren't poor. Um,
Mhm.
you know, and and so to my father's credit, he kept his word.
Mhm.
So when we came to the United States, my father didn't, know much about Judaism. So he just followed the lead for what my mom did. My mom lit Shabbos candles every
Mhm.
Friday night. In our house, um, Friday night dinner was sacred. We had a rule that your friends were not allowed to call the house. Back then there was no such thing as caller ID. So
Mhm.
when the phone would ring on a Friday night in the middle of the Shabbos meal, all the kids would crawl under the table and just pray to God it wasn't one of their friends, right? Okay, just
Right.
right. Everybody knew don't call the Hashimis Friday night. Oh, you want to go to the football game afterwards? Sure, no problem, right?
Right.
But
Just not during dinner,
right.
right.
And so I was making kiddush, right, on Friday night from the time I was 5, 6, 7 years old,
Mm.
right? My father
Mhm.
didn't know how, so I've been, I did that for the family. Um, I have uh, I have two younger sisters, one who's 5 years younger than me, one who's 10 years younger than me. And then when I was 7 years old, my parents adopted my mom's first cousin,
Wow.
and his parents were both ill and couldn't take
Mhm.
care of him anymore, and so he came to live with us. Um, and we did. I went to Hebrew school after school, after elementary school, public school. I went to Hebrew school on Mondays and Wednesdays, and
Mm.
Sunday school every Sunday morning. And then when I got to high school, I went to Hebrew high school.
Mm.
Um, we had a rule in our house that you weren't allowed to date non-Jews, and
Mm.
that's a very interesting story. My father, a lot of what you hear about his stories about my father, but I don't want to shortchange my mother. My mother was the spiritual driver in our house, right? She's the one that lit Shabbos, and we kept kosher inside the house, right? We had
Mhm.
separate meat and milk dishes, and we went to the kosher butcher, and we went, you know, um, every Yom Tif, Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, Pesach, Sukkot, Shavuos. We were a very traditional Jewish family. Um, and my father would go to shul and he would put on a tallis and he'd put on a yarmulke and he'd take out a siddur or a machzor and he'd sit there all day long on Yom Kippur.
Hmm.
And he would fast too.
Wow.
He wouldn't eat.
Wow. Really
He
incredible.
and and
Did he ever think of converting, or that wasn't part of his?
so Rabbi Levertov in Chabad,
Mhm.
there's a long story about how Rabbi Levertov and my dad are friends, and they're still friends to this day. We don't have time to go into that whole story, but just suffice to say that the Chabad rabbi, the head rabbi in Arizona, is close friends with my dad. And
Mm.
he tried to get my dad to convert, and my dad basically said, "No, you don't understand. I'm a Muslim. That's
Mm.
who I am." And so, um, but in my house, we never talked about Islam unless you asked, right?
Mhm.
My father wouldn't bring it up. If you asked the question, he would answer you, right?
Mhm.
But it was not discussed. And we lived a Jewish life. And like I
Mhm.
said, we weren't allowed to date non-Jews. So when I was
Mm.
in eighth grade, I brought a friend who happened to be of the female persuasion over to our house, and my dad came home, for dinner after work, and she's there, and he's like, "Hi, who's this? What's your name?" "Hi, my name is Mary Waters," and so he's like, "Oh, nice to meet you," and he's very cordial, polite. Says, "I think it's time for dinner. You need to go home now." After she leaves, he's like, "Mary Waters, doesn't sound like a very Jewish name. I said, no,
Wow.
she's not Jewish. She's a Mormon. And he says,
Hmm.
what did you not understand? That you're not allowed to fraternize with 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 non-Jewish girls. You're not allowed to date non-Jewish
Mm.
girls. And I said, what? You're how
Yeah.
hypocritical is that? You're married to
Right.
you and mom are intermarried. Like, that's just so hypocritical. If you can marry mom, how come I can't go out with a non-Jewish girl? Like, it's such hypocrisy. And
Hmm.
and you know, my father is a very intimidating man. He's because he's just very direct. Something that
Very no nonsense. Right.
I've inherited. And he looked at me very seriously, and I know it sounds really harsh, but there's incredible wisdom in the words that he said to me. He looked at me very seriously, said, "Son, just because a father beats his children does not give those children the right to grow up and beat their children."
Mm. Hmm.
And what was he trying to convey? I know it's a harsh thing, right? But what he was trying to convey is those are my mistakes, right? So
Hmm.
just because, mistakes and quote, right? In other words, just because I didn't doesn't give you the right to
Right.
do it. The rules in this house, you live in, my father used to say, my roof, my my rules, right?
Right.
So
That's
that's
that's so interesting because, he was such a Muslim, he didn't wanna convert till today, and
so
yet he still had those strong beliefs that this is what you're gonna marry Jewish only.
right. So this was so I actually asked my father this right before my bar mitzvah. I said to my dad, I said, Dad, you had family members who were the imams of a mosque in Kabul
Mhm,
for like hundreds of years. How could you raise your children as Jews? So
mhm,
asked him point blank, and he said, and if the people listening to this take anything away from my story, I hope it's this. This is, to me, um, the biggest aspect of wisdom that you can learn from my father. He basically said, "Look, son, when you get married, you're forming a partnership with your spouse, right?"
mhm,
And he says, husband and wife can disagree on tiny things, on small little things. But when it comes to the big things, there has to be a unified front,
hmm,
right?
mhm,
There has to be a unified front. Why? He says, because if there's not on big things, if
mhm,
one parent's saying one thing and the other parent's saying the other thing, one of three things is going to happen. They're either going to side with the mother,
mhm,
or they're going to side with the father, or they're going to tell both of them,
hmm,
I'm
right,
not, you both are crazy. I'm not going to do any of this. Right.
mhm,
And my father is a man of God. He believes in God. And he said, for me, the main thing that I want is that y- you believe in God. So
mhm,
my mom's big thing was tikkun olam, basically, which is repairing the world, right? Healing the world, right? Which is a big thing within, the conservative and reform
mhm,
movement, right? That Jews are here to repair the world, right? Okay. My father's was that you're not here to serve yourself, you're here to serve others, right?
mhm,
And you're here to serve God, right? So,
mhm,
and so in my house it was beat into my head, right, that we're here to serve God, believe in God, serve in God, and help make the world a better place. That was the
mhm,
ethos in my family. And so
mhm.
my father said, if I ever brought up Islam, then there
It
might
would be
be the
confusing.
risk
Mhm,
the risk that you guys say, I'm not going to be a Jew, I'm not going to be a Muslim, and I'm not going to
mhm,
believe in God. Like, this is
mhm,
nonsense. You guys are
mhm,
crazy, right? So he didn't want
mhm,
that. So he says, Jews are people of the book. You have a beautiful religion. He says, and I want you to, to believe in God. Now, about I'd say a year later, um, after that conversation, that was right before my bar mitzvah. About a year later, after my bar mitzvah, I was sitting in McDonald's eating a Big Mac. So although we kept kosher at home,
kosher at home.
we ate we ate non-kosher meat and milk together, but strangely we didn't eat shrimp or pork, right? So
Mhm,
it was
mhm,
this weird kind of kosher thing that we did. And but I was sitting in a Big Mac, eating a Big Mac in a McDonald's, and I had this thought pop into my head that says, "What's kosher about you other than your mother's plates?"
Mhm.
I was
Mhm.
13 I was 13 and a half years old. I put down the Big Mac, I didn't finish it, and that's the last time I've ever eaten non-kosher meat and milk together, ever.
Wow. Wow, that's incredible for a
Eh
13-year-old.
yeah, and so I started keeping more, um, kosher than my family. It's
Mhm.
interesting, the Lubavitcher Rebbe, the Rebbe, um, has a discourse where he talks about how every Jew has a connection to one particular mitzvah, and you don't always know what it is. I'm blessed
Mm.
to know what that is. Kashrus, keeping
Kashrus.
kosher is is
Mhm.
is the thing that's always, drawn me to be more observant and kept me observant throughout my life. Um,
Interesting. And you don't know why it was, like, it was just this epiphany that you just had in McDonald's. Wow.
if you understand what
Just a
Chabad
spiritual
means,
thing,
what
right?
what does Chabad mean? It stands for Chachma, Bina, and Das, right? So the Chachma is that spark that you
Mm,
have. The Bina is wrestling with it, right? Trying to, and the Das is understanding it. So
mm,
so I don't know why that
right.
that
Just
Chachma
something on a soul level.
popped in my head.
Yeah.
But that's what I did, and so I went to so I started keeping kosher. I would still eat like salads and fish in restaurants
Mhm,
and stuff like that. So I wasn't too concerned about the dishes and anything. It was more about what was I consuming. And and then I went to college, and um, when I was going into high school, I told my parents, high school is the most trivial part of life. I don't really care if I make any friends. I'm just going to get a scholarship to college. That's what I'm going to do. And that's exactly what I did. I got a free ride to any school in Arizona. It's called a Regent Scholarship. So I decided to go to Arizona State University and study aerospace engineering. And so uh, I, I I get into college, and I got involved in the Israel Action Committee. My family, my older brother was a staunch Zionist, so we talked a lot about Israel, very strong affinity for Israel. Even my father is a Zionist, strangely enough.
mm.
And
Really?
yes,
Interesting.
and so the my sophomore year of college, I had a girlfriend, and she basically dumped me. Okay,
Mm,
and I was alone. And
mm.
um, when I got to college, I said, "Hey, I'll make friends in college." And I'm sitting alone in my apartment,
Yeah.
and I realized, you don't have any friends, right? I'm all alone, right? And I started to ask myself,
Why?
why is it that you don't have any friends? It was like I didn't really care in high school, right? I
Mhm,
intentionally didn't care. Like I didn't,
mhm. You
to
weren't
this
looking for that.
I wasn't
Mhm,
looking for that. It wasn't part of my what I wanted to do. But I wanted to make friends, right? But I didn't
mhm,
have any. So over the course of like 2 or 3 weeks, I was really wrestling with this self. I was doing a lot of self introspection as why don't you have any friends? And you know, I came to realize that the reason that I didn't have any friends is because I'm a Balgaiva. And what does that mean? A Balgaiva is somebody who is an arrogant person.
mhm.
Um, and I have a ginormous ego. Um, uh, and but arrogance manifests itself differently in different people, right? It sometimes
Mhm,
manifests itself in narcissism, and it manifests itself in other ways, right? Okay.
mhm,
My specific form of arrogance was that I was a know-it-all. I was that
mhm,
guy that in any conversation always tried to have the last word. Out argue you, out debate you, know more facts than you,
mhm.
basically prove that you're an idiot and I'm smart.
Right.
Well,
Well, it sounds like you were a smart person, and that's maybe why you had that.
yeah,
Yeah.
okay, but just because you're
Right,
smart doesn't mean you have to
right,
treat people that
100%.
way, right? And
Mhm.
so I realized that, hey, maybe that's why
People don't
people
like
don't want
that.
to be around me. It's because
Right.
I make them feel like an idiot, right? And
Right.
so I I I made a commitment right there and there. It's called a hachlata, a
Mhm. A
commitment,
resolution.
a
Mhm.
resolution. and that I was going to make it my life's mission to try to be humble.
Wow.
And I'm
Mm.
still working on it today. It's,
It sounds like you're really a man of action. You have a decision, you have a thought in your mind, and you just carry through.
right. So, it's kind of like an alcoholic admitting, hey, I'm an alcoholic, right?
Right.
And you're always an alcoholic and you have these demons that you have to deal with. And you've got to have, steps and measures and methods to deal with that, right? When that comes up, how do you control it? How do you
Mhm.
manage it? So, literally 2 weeks after I make this commitment to myself, my older brother, my adopted brother, he had gone to school uh, in Tucson at the University of Arizona, and he had a best friend who is now in graduate school at Arizona State. So he was in graduate school. So he was older than I was, about 6 or 7 years older than I was, David Mikowski. And we were involved in the Israel Action Committee at the Hillel. So we would have our meetings in the Hillel building and whatever. So one day we were having a meeting, Israel Action Committee meeting, and the Intifada had just started, I think, or something, or maybe not. I can't remember exactly, but let's say things were really unstable in Eretz Yisrael
Mhm.
in Israel, and so we're planning some activities, and David says to me, he says, "Hey, I notice you're always here for the Israel Action Committee, but I never see you here for Shabbos.
Right.
Why? Why aren't you ever here at the Hillel for Shabbos?" And I said, "Well, they play a guitar and it really creeps me out. I'm just not my
Mm.
vibe. It's just not my vibe." Right. I grew up in a very traditional conservative synagogue. Right. I mean, yes, the men and women sat together, but the women didn't go up to the bima. The women didn't read the Torah. Right. It was, I mean, you know, that
Very
was
traditional.
very
Mhm.
traditional. So he's like, "Well, there's a new Chabad house that just opened up over here, right, 2 blocks away." And he says it's, incredible, beautiful family, cute little kids. The challah is
Mm.
amazing, right? Why don't you come? So you'll recall I was very lonely at the time.
Sure.
And so I decided to go.
Mm.
And you remember I grew up, I knew how to daven. I grew up going to
Mhm.
Hebrew school, so I knew how to
Mhm.
daven. And so I got there and we had the afternoon services, mincha, right? And between mincha and Kabbalah Shabbos, the beginning of the Sabbath service, the Rabbi Yossi Kahanov, and his wife Rivki, she was the rebbitzin
Shlucha.
there, right?
Mhm.
Um, he would give over a sikha from the Rebbe, a discourse from the Rebbe.
Mhm.
So, I could kind of see out of the corner of eyes watching me while I'm davening mincha, right? I'm praying, right? And he's like, okay, this guy knows what he's doing. All right. All right. But then he sits down, he opens up and he starts giving over sikha. And what does the sikha say? What does it say? It says that you are like a vessel. You're like a vessel. And if that vessel is filled up with your own ego, there's no room inside of you
Mm.
for God.
Wow.
And that a Jew needs to be bittul or humble, but really abnegated is a better word, right? It's not really
Mhm.
humble. A Jew needs to abnegate their ego. They need to control their ego so that there's place in you for God.
Mm.
And I was just like, whoa.
Whoa.
I'm like,
That was just
okay,
your resolution. Wow.
so if you don't believe in divine providence, come and talk to me.
Right.
Okay, I'll tell you a lot of
Right.
divine providence stories about my career and other things we don't have time for. But I'm a big believer in divine providence. So here I am. I'm like, okay. So we go through the meal, and the challah was amazing, and the kids were cute, right? And we get to the end, and I'm sitting there, and I'm the last one there. David's left everything, and I say to Rabbi Kahanov, "Hey, Rabbi Kahanov, does this like Hasidus thing? Does it just implore you to be humble, or does it teach you how to be humble?" And so he said, "Hold on a second." And he went over and he got the Tanya, which is the book from the Alter Rebbe, the founder of the Lubavitch movement and the first Lubavitcher Rebbe. And he says, "Here's the humble man's guide." And he said, "Let's sit." I said, "Okay,
Wow.
let's go. Let's." So we sat there and we learned the first chapter of Tanya. And at the end, I basically said, there's some things at the end of the first chapter of Tanya that deal with the difference between Jews and non-Jews. Okay. And I said to Rabbi Kahanov, I said, "Hey, we need to stop." He says, "Why?"
Mm.
I said, because my father is a righteous Gentile, and
Mm,
I'm not. This doesn't. I don't understand what the rabbi's talking about over here. And he says, that's okay. I said, so do you have anything else we can learn? He says, yeah, we can learn. There's plenty to learn. No worries. So I basically started going there. Started becoming observant. Um, uh, stayed observant until I graduated college. Was going to make Aliyah to Israel, but my father
mm,
lost his business. So my brother and I kept my started. I went and got a job. My brother and I basically kept my parents out of bankruptcy
oh, wow.
for a couple of years until my dad got back on his feet. Um, and then I decided to go to graduate school. Um, Now, during that time, Rabbi Kahanov and his wife Rivki left Arizona. They ran out of money and they went on shlichus somewhere else in Florida. And so I kind of lost my way a little bit, and I did
Mm,
not stay observant, but I always stayed kosher.
kosher.
I
Wow. The one
always
mitzvah
stayed
that kept
kosher.
you.
And kashrus, we don't have time to get into it, and actually ended up landing me my wife. Um,
You
uh,
wanna tell us quickly how
just
that
quickly,
happened?
I met her at a party, and somebody offers us a Bartles and James, which is non-kosher wine, and I said no, and she said, "What, you don't drink?" And I said, "No, I actually keep kosher, strictly
Kosher.
kosher," and that's how our relationship started, and whatever. Um, and
Wow.
but I ended up going to graduate school at Harvard. Uh, a couple years later, I got a master's in public policy. I actually used to have aspirations of being the president, so that's why I made that joke at the beginning, but
Uh,
not anymore.
yeah.
I've been seriously disavowed that, but uh, and when I went there, I went back to the Chabad house this time with Rabbi Shmuley Posner and his wife Hani, who have helped literally thousands of Jews return to their roots. And My wife and I went on that journey together. She was there with me, um, and um, we got married. We're blessed with six beautiful children. Our oldest is 30. Our youngest is 20. Four
Mm,
four boys, two girls, and God bless. We have two grandkids as well.
wow,
And
amazing.
Yeah, it's been an incredible journey. So
Wow, that's really what a story. Now, when you look back at your life, like, what do you think like, do you ever think, what if certain things hadn't happened? What if I didn't take my mother's route? Like, where would I be now?
yeah, I mean, that's why I'm such a big believer in divine providence, right?
Mm,
I can see the hand of God. God sent the former Soviet Union to to
wow.
to overthrow Afghanistan to get me out
Just
of
for
there,
you, right?
right?
Just for you.
Right? It's like,
Right, right.
you have to look like, like the story of Purim, right? The story of
Mhm,
Purim is all these things that don't appear to be miracles. They appear to be
mhm,
just regular everyday events, right? But it's
mhm,
really the hand of God, right? So that's
mm,
why I'm a big believer in divine providence. I see it all throughout my life, right?
mhm.
And then the other thing is there's a specific teaching from one of the Lubavitcher Rebbe's, the Rebbe Maharash. Okay, he was the he had a teaching called Lechatchila a river, which means, translated, to begin with, be on the other side
Mm.
of the, and then in parentheses, of the problem, of the challenge, of the issue. In other words, there's no such thing as a problem or an issue. Just be on the other side of it. And if I say the kashrus is the one mitzvah, the one Hasidic teaching that really resonates with me personally is l'chad chiller river, right? Just to begin with, be on the other side of it. Whatever challenges life throws you,
That
um,
there's no problem, just you're gonna overcome it. It's
the,
just something that
God does
that
not
you
give
don't
you a
even.
challenge you cannot overcome. Because
Mhm,
God's not cruel, right? God,
mhm,
right? And so
Right.
I would say that I have adopted the approach. My wife and I, we have a partnership on how we want to raise our kids.
Mhm.
There's I have a s I have a, I tell people all the time. There's really only one reason to get married. There's a lot of aspects to marriage, right? There's a lot of
Mhm.
things, right? And there's a lot of benefits to marriage. But the reason that you get married is to form a partnership with your spouse and to pass your values on to your children.
Wow.
The last mitzvah my mom did was light her Shabbos candles.
Wow. Wow.
Yeah. So
And that she definitely raised a son to be, someone who she can be proud of, so that's very special.
yeah,
What a merit for her.
yeah,
Incredible.
yeah.
Really incredible.
For all the people who are parents out there who have children or who are or younger people who might be watching this, or God willing, hopefully you'll get married soon. You should be blessed with finding your spouse. Um, have a unified front.
Mhm.
Form a partnership with your spouse, right? And decide what values you as a couple are going to pass on to your children and stick to it, both of you
Mhm.
together. Never let go of each of that commitment, because
Mhm.
you know um like even in the observant world, right? Even in the observant world, unfortunately, there are a lot of children that
Mhm.
grow up and they don't stay observant. And thank
Mhm.
God, all of my kids are observant, right?
Right.
And I'm that's nothing special, but I do there's a lot of people like that, but I think
Well,
it's
I
from
think
that.
that is special. Could you tell us something about how you inspire your children and what message you wanted your children to hear throughout life? I mean, you said what was inspiring for you from the Hasidic teachings. What do you think gave your children that inspiration to be observant and to keep on in their path?
um I'm a big believer that so there's a Hasidic teaching, for example, that if you take water and you throw it directly on fire, what does
Mhm.
it do? It puts the fire out,
Mhm.
right? But if you put a boundary, a pot between the two, and you put the
Mhm.
water into the pot, right? Okay. And then you put the pot on the fire, all of a sudden, the water and the fire start to work together.
Mhm. Mhm.
Okay. So your 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 soul is put into a body and sent down into this world, right? Okay. And so you think of as your soul as fire, right? Okay. Right. And the world as the water. So if you get down here, if you don't have a boundary, right,
Mhm.
in between, the water is going to put out the fire. It's going to grind you down. It's going to, right,
Mhm.
but what's the boundary is Torah. It's the
Mhm.
rules, right?
Mhm.
Rules, Torah, the framework, the blueprint for how Jews are supposed to behave and live their lives, and non-Jews as well, right? Okay. Right? Is that boundary, that set of rules. It's not love to let your children just, roam in the street and play, right?
Mhm. Mhm.
That's not love, right? Love is setting boundaries and having a set of rules and a set of principles to live your life by, so that the fire that God put in your soul, right, can work with the world to
Mhm.
work together to make it to do something productive, right?
Right.
And so what I've always, my kids know my roof, my rules, right?
Right.
Right?
Right.
I wonder where I got that from, but
But seems to work.
I'll
Yeah.
tell you, my father. So when I was becoming observant, right? When I was becoming observant, there were only two people in my family that encouraged me to become observant. My uncle Mickey, may he rest in peace. Okay, he gave me my first pair of tefillin. Okay,
Mm,
he was my mother's uncle. He was who my mom worked for. She worked at his tax, company, and my father.
Mm. Wow.
That my father, my father
Mm.
encouraged me to become, as I was becoming a he's like, go, keep
Do it.
going, um, and so th- the point is, the world's challenging enough, right? A lot of people think that the rules and restrictions of Torah are somehow like a prison, and it's
Mm.
quite the opposite. It's actually
Mm.
liberating,
Mm.
because you might have a very difficult situation that comes up, right? So my daughter, one of my daughters had cancer, okay?
Mm.
And she had liver cancer, and she needed a liver transplant in order to save her life. And so there was a choice. You either wait for a cadaveric liver, which is, from somebody who dies, right? Okay. Or you can have a living donor. But there's a question
Mm.
in Jewish law. Can you give up your own life to save somebody else's life? The answer is
Mhm.
is no, you can't. Okay.
Mhm.
So when my daughter, they said she needs a transplant, they did some blood tests and they found that my wife was a match, but I was not. Okay,
Mhm.
from a organ donor perspective. So, um, so I remember calling our Rav here, and he says there's only one person in the world that can answer this question. Rav Moshe Tendler, Olav Shalom, may he rest in peace. So he gave me his number, and so I called Rabbi Tendler's office, and I said, "Hi, my name's Yosef Hashimi. I'm from Pittsburgh. My daughter is sick, and my rabbi said that Rabbi Tendler is the only person in the world who can answer my question." So she says, "Hold on a second." Within 1 minute, Rabbi Tendler was on the phone.
Mm.
Um, I explained to them the whole situation. How he's asking me all these types of questions. How big's your daughter? My daughter, was obviously she didn't weigh very much because she was going through chemotherapy and she couldn't keep food down, and so she was very light at the time. How heavy is your wife? How tall is your wife? And he's asking me all these questions, and then he finally says, "Okay, she can do it.
She
Okay,
can do what? She can
she can be the living
yeah, the
donor
living donor. She
for
could give
for
part of
my
her
daughter."
liver.
Why? Because of her size and whatever, she's not risking her life
Mm. Mhm.
for her daughter, right?
Mhm.
Okay.
Got it.
Okay. Now, if I had to make that decision on my own, or my
For
wife had to make
sure.
that decision, we'd be racking our brains, and it would
Absolutely.
have been torture. Torture. And then what happens, like,
For
y-
sure.
no, Torah, you just turn to Torah. This is
It's the
right.
guidance.
It's the
Right.
and we turn to Torah. We turn to the guy who knows the Torah in this particular thing. He says this is what Torah allows, not I'm allowing. This is what Torah allows.
Mhm.
This is what God
Mhm.
allows, right?
Mhm.
And thank God, you know, my daughter is 20 years old now. She was,
Wow.
1 years old at the time. And so, you know, it's in terms of raising my kids, that's what my wife and I, not just me, my wife and I, is that, hey, you know,
That united front.
A, it's a united front, but B, that Torah gives you a way of life that is meaningful, that helps you deal with the challenges of life, right? Because life is full of suffering. And
Mhm.
you may have a sick child, right?
Mhm.
Right? And what do you do? Lachat chila a
Mhm.
river to begin with, be on
Mhm.
the other side of it. My wife was in the hospital for 29 days the first when she first took my daughter to the hospital. She didn't come home for an entire month. And I
Wow.
remember sitting at the kitchen table when she got home, and we sat there, we just looked at each other for like literally 15 minutes. We didn't say anything to each other.
Mm.
And I finally turned to my wife and I said, honey, we are not going to become a family with a sick child. Lechatchila a river. To begin with, we're
Mhm.
going to be on the other side of this challenge. And my dad, he left my mother, he came to live here with us for 4 months, right? And he was the night shift guy. He would stay with my daughter at night. But, you know, have a set of values, whatever they are. It doesn't have to be, you know, Hasidic values, or whatever it is, whatever you and your spouse choose it, stick to it, and raise your kids and pass on your values to your kids. That's what I hope people take away from this, because I am a product of my parents.
Mhm.
Plain and simple. Plain and
Right.
simple, right? I'm a Jew because my mom's Jewish, but I'm also a Jew because my dad agreed that he was going to raise us Jewish, and he kept his word, and he did it with all his heart.
Thank you so much, Yosef Hashimi, for sharing your story with us. What an incredible story. And may you continue to be a merit for your mother, who's passed on, and be an example for your children. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Really appreciate you giving me the opportunity to share my story with everybody.
Wow, what an incredible journey. Throughout it all, as through so many of these interviews, we see really the hand of God guiding us. How Yosef ended up the way he did was really God pushing him. As he said, the whole thing in Afghanistan happened just because of him, because he needed to get out of there. It's incredible to see also how he was so, when he decided to do something, he went through and he went through with it all the way. And I think he clearly got that from his father, who seems to be a very righteous individual, very interested in him becoming a child of God, a child who believes in God. And as he said, his father was the one person besides his uncle who really encouraged him to become religious all the way. I loved his message about how life is just shouldn't be in front of us. It should not be an issue. It's l'chatchila riba. We go over it. We just go ahead and we do it all the way without thinking that there is any issue or there is any problem. And that seems to be really how Yosef led so many aspects of his life, in becoming observant and choosing from when he was 13 years old not to eat anything that was not kosher anymore, in choosing to learn how to become more humble, and in choosing to do so, finding Chabad and finding his path back to complete religion, complete uh, following in religion. I really loved as well the last part of his story, in which he spoke about his daughter and how Torah really guides us and how it's always a guiding light. We have so many issues or challenges or problems, and we don't know which way to go. And some of these problems are really, like in his case, a life and death situation, and how Torah provides that guidance, and how it is such a comfort for us to have that guiding light and that Torah of life. If you enjoyed these interviews, I hope you are subscribed to Chabad.org/extraordinary. You can find us on YouTube, on all podcast platforms, and as well as on Chabad.org. Thank you so much for watching and for being part of this extraordinary community.